Hey everyone, welcome to our deep dive. We're going to be really digging into the science of mental health today. We're taking excerpts from neuroscientist Camilla Nord's book, The Balanced Brain, and exploring the really complex relationship between our brain and our mental well-being.
So, are you ready to have your mind blown? Let's jump right in.
One of the most fascinating things Nord talks about is this idea of hedonic hotspots. Imagine like these little fireworks going off in your brain, little sparks of pleasure. Scientists have actually pinpointed these hotspots, and believe it or not, they actually study rats to figure this out. You know those experiments where rats go crazy for sugar water? Well, those are actually helping researchers understand where those pleasure centers light up in the brain.
And it's not just about rats and their love of sugar. These hotspots are directly related to why you might crave certain foods, like chocolate. It all comes back to those pleasure centers firing up.
So we're all just chasing that hedonic hotspot high?
In a way, yeah. But here's where things get even more interesting. Our brains also have these things called hedonic cold spots. Think of these as areas that kind of dampen pleasure. They're why you might have an aversion to certain foods or experiences.
Okay, so that explains my lifelong hatred of mayonnaise. Sorry, mayo fans, it's just not my thing.
No need to apologize. We all have our unique preferences. And those cold spots play a big part in shaping those likes and dislikes. But what's even more fascinating is how these hot spots and cold spots are actually part of a much larger system called the brain-body axis. And it really highlights how interconnected our physical sensations and emotions really are.
It's like that feeling of being hangry. You know when you're starving and suddenly everyone around you is the worst?
Exactly, that's a perfect example. So when your stomach's empty, it sends those hunger signals to the brain. But sometimes your brain, well, it misinterprets those signals.
Yeah.
Instead of, oh, I need food, it's like, danger. Everyone is the worst.
Wow, so our brains really can be terrible interpreters.
Well, they're doing their best with the information they have. Think about it, a racing heart. A racing heart can mean so many things. It could be fear, excitement, maybe even love. It all depends on the context, right? So your brain, it has to constantly decipher what these physical sensations are trying to tell it.
So it's like our brains are trying to figure out this code, like, okay, what does this rapid heartbeat mean? Is this a good thing? Is this a bad thing? I don't know.
Exactly. And that's where things can get really interesting when it comes to mental health.
So our brains are busy trying to decode all these signals. And not only that, but Nord says they're also making predictions about the future, like what's going to happen next, especially when it comes to rewards.
Right, like when you're really craving a milkshake and you're thinking about how good it's going to be, and then you take that first sip and it's even better than you imagined.
Okay, so like when it exceeds your expectations.
Exactly. And that surprise, that's your brain getting caught off guard by a reward that's even better than it predicted.
Nord calls these reward prediction errors. Reward prediction errors. So that surprise is actually a good thing.
It is. It's like your brain is saying, ooh, I like that. Let's do that again. It's basically learning to chase those rewarding experiences.
Okay, that makes sense. But what happens when our brains don't predict those rewards very well?
Well, that's when things can get a little complicated. If your dopamine system, the one responsible for those good feelings, if it's not calibrated quite right, it can lead to some problems. Like, you might start underestimating positive events and overestimating the negative ones.
So some people's brains might be kind of wired to expect bad things to happen more often?
That's the gist of it, yeah. And researchers believe that this might actually play a role in conditions like depression.
Wow, that's pretty heavy stuff. And speaking of dopamine, Nord talks about these kind of wild experiments from back in the 50s.
Oh yeah, the rat studies.
Yeah, the rat studies. Can you refresh my memory on those? What exactly did they do?
Well, they basically gave rats this option. They could choose brain stimulation that would trigger a dopamine release, or they could choose food and water.
Hold on, so they could choose between like a hit of brain pleasure or taking care of their basic needs.
Yeah, basically. And the shocking thing was that the rats would choose that brain stimulation again and again, even to the point of exhaustion. Like, they were neglecting their survival needs just to get more of that dopamine rush.
That sounds a lot like addiction.
It does, doesn't it? But here's the thing, and this is important. Those rats, they weren't necessarily choosing pure pleasure. They were driven by this intense wanting. And that's a really subtle but crucial distinction.
Okay, I'm not sure I follow. What's the difference between, like, really wanting something and enjoying it?
Well, think about it like this. That feeling of, I need that now, it's not always about how much you'll actually enjoy the thing itself, right?
Okay, that's true. Sometimes you just get fixated on something, even if it's not even that great in the end.
Exactly. And there are more modern examples of this too. Take the drug mephedrone, sometimes called meow meow.
Yeah, meow, yeah. I think I remember hearing about that.
Well, it's an amphetamine, and it basically sends your dopamine levels through the roof. People crave it, even if they admit that the experience itself isn't always enjoyable. It's all about that chase, that intense wanting.
So they're chasing that feeling even if the reality of the experience isn't all that great.
Exactly. It's the wanting that takes over. And this really shows you how powerful, but also how tricky our brain's reward system can be. It's meant to be essential for survival, right? Like it motivates us to eat and drink and connect with others,
Sure.
but it can be manipulated. And that's when you see things like addiction and compulsive behaviors. It's a powerful force in our brains that can sometimes steer us in the wrong direction.
So we've talked about how our brains experience pleasure and process all those signals from our body, and even how they try to predict what rewards are coming. But what about treatment? Like, what can we actually do to help our brains when they're struggling?
Well, it's interesting. A lot of effective treatments, whether it's medication or therapy or even just like lifestyle changes, it often comes down to kind of reshaping our brain's predictions and their emotional responses. You know, it's like we're trying to retrain our brains a little bit.
Oh, interesting. So it's not as simple as like fixing a chemical imbalance or just erasing all the bad thoughts.
Not really, no.
Okay.
I mean, think about the placebo effect. There's tons of research showing that even when people know they're taking a sugar pill, they can still experience real benefits.
Really?
Yeah, it's pretty wild. It suggests that our brains are capable of healing just because we expect them to.
Wow. That's kind of like the power of positive thinking, but on a whole other level.
Exactly. Our brains, they learn to associate certain things with feeling better, like taking medication, for example. And those associations, they can be incredibly powerful.
That's amazing. So how does this whole idea of reshaping our brains actually work in practice?
Well, Nord talks about a bunch of different approaches in the book, like antidepressants, for instance. They're often associated with boosting serotonin, right?
Right.
But they might actually be working by kind of subtly shifting our emotional bias. So instead of just like filling a chemical void, they're helping our brains to kind of see the world through a more optimistic lens.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah, it's a different way of looking at it. And then there's psychotherapy, like CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy,
Right.
that helps us to identify and challenge those negative thought patterns that can really drag us down.
Yeah.
So by recognizing those thoughts and reframing them, we can actually become more receptive to positive experiences.
It's like CBT is giving us the tools to be our own brain coaches in a way.
Exactly.
I like that.
Yeah.
Okay, what else?
Let's see. She also talks about mindfulness, which is all about being present in the moment and accepting your thoughts and feelings without judgment.
Oh, right.
It's about weakening the grip of those unhelpful thought patterns. You know, the ones that can spiral into anxiety or depression.
So instead of getting swept away by every little thought, you're learning to just observe it without letting it control you.
Exactly.
That's powerful stuff. I can see how all of these can be super helpful for people.
Yeah, and you know, for more severe cases, Nord even talks about things like brain stimulation.
Like TMS and stuff like that.
Yeah, exactly. Things like TMS and deep brain stimulation.
Then just remind me, how do those work again?
So basically, they use magnetic or electrical impulses to directly change the brain's activity in certain areas,
Okay.
especially the areas that are linked to, like mood regulation.
Interesting. So it's like hitting the reset button on those specific brain circuits.
Pretty much, yeah. It can be really effective, but it's usually reserved for more serious situations.
Yeah. Right, that makes sense. So it seems like we have a lot of options when it comes to treatment and managing our mental health. But I know Nord also mentioned something about like the potential downsides of healthy habits too.
Right.
Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, it's easy to think about things like exercise and dieting as always being beneficial.
Right, of course.
And for a lot of people, they are. But, you know, Nord, she points out that for some, these behaviors can become a little bit compulsive and even detrimental in some cases.
Wow. So even things that we normally associate with being good for us can backfire in a way.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, it just goes to show how complex our brains are and how important it is to find that balance in all things.
That's a really good point. Now, Nord ends her book on this really thought-provoking note.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, she talks about how the way we define a mental health disorder, it's actually fluid. And it changes over time along with cultural norms.
That's interesting.
Yeah, and she gives the example of hysteria. It's a common diagnosis for women back in the day. But these days, it's pretty much considered outdated.
Huh. It makes you wonder, like, what will they think of our diagnoses years from now?
Right, exactly. Like, could some of what we call mental health disorders today just be, reflections of our current anxieties and cultural pressures?
It's definitely something to think about. And it highlights the importance of approaching mental health with nuance and with compassion.
I completely agree. Well, this has been a fascinating deep dive. Where does this leave us? What are your final thoughts?
I think the biggest takeaway is that understanding the science behind mental health is a journey. It's not about having all the answers right now.
Right.
It's about being open to learning more,
Mm-hmm.
to asking questions, and challenging what we think we know.
I love that. And as we learn more, we empower ourselves to advocate for better treatments and ultimately better well-being for ourselves and for others too. Well said. To all our listeners out there, thank you so much for joining us on this incredible deep dive into the world of mental health. And remember, keep those brains healthy and keep asking questions.